In this episode of the UX Tea Break, I discuss reusing participants in usability tests. I was asked this question in my Facebook group by Caroline Keane. I'm iterating my design for the Gift Giver app as part of the course. Do I have to test this iteration with completely different users to those I tested for the initial design, she asked. I chose this question because I've come across it in various guises. What it really boils down to is, can you reuse participants in a usability test? Now, reusing test participants certainly has some pragmatic appeal. If you're working on a specialised or niche application, it can be really difficult to recruit participants. People like brain surgeons or CEOs of multinational companies. These people are so tricky to find that it's tempting to reuse the contacts you already have. And there are other situations where you may not have much choice. For example, imagine you're developing an enterprise app for a small HR team in a company. If that team has only 8 employees or so, you're obviously going to have to reuse your participants if you want to do iterative design. But there are other arguments for reusing participants that go beyond recruitment. You could argue that reusing participants reduces test anxiety because participants now know what's expected, so they'll feel less stressed by the testing situation. They've been through a usability test with you once, so you've built some rapport with them and they know the drill. Perhaps that will improve data quality. And you can also ask them to compare the new design with the previous version they've used. I mean, of course, their memories won't be perfect, but they can probably recall enough to remember if a task is easier or harder with the new design. And another argument for reusing participants is that sometimes it can make sense politically. Imagine you have an especially important customer as a participant. Involving them a second time and asking them to use a new design that's been changed based on their feedback shows that you're actually listening to what they say. But despite all of those advantages, in my view, the drawbacks of reusing participants are overwhelming. One serious problem is that your participants learn about the application. That unusual control that puzzled them in the first test, but which they got to learn by the end of the session, well, now it's second nature to them. And even if your second design fixed that control, people will still remember the kinds of tasks you wanted them to carry out and the required workflow. So by involving them a second time, you won't be able to assess the product's usability for first-time users or for people who may use the system irregularly, a few times a year. And that applies to most consumer-facing digital products like websites. A second problem with reusing participants is that it'll raise a red flag with stakeholders who want to criticise your research. They'll remember the particularly vocal participant from the earlier test and ask you why you're using the same person again. Are these users representative? They might ask. And it's a good point. It's possible, just by chance, you have 1 or 2 unusual participants. If you continually test with the same people, you risk optimizing the design for them rather than for the user group more generally. At the very least, it will give your product team a biased view of users. They won't appreciate the diversity that's in the wider population if you stick to using the same people. And in my experience, there's something different about a test participant who's done more than one usability test. After a while, they turn into design critics rather than users of the product. I've come across this more than once in remote, unmoderated usability tests. Rather than leaning in and actually using the product, I've seen participants sitting back and providing a design critique. You don't want to do it like that, you should do it like Amazon. That's not the kind of feedback you want in a usability test. But for me, there's one overriding reason why you shouldn't reuse participants. The entire philosophy of small sample usability testing is based on the assumption that you're following an iterative design process where each redesign is going to be retested with another handful of users. That's why we can get away with small samples in usability tests, because we're going to run another test in the next sprint, and then another test, and so on, gradually building up our sample as we progress through design. So we may just have 5 people in our first test, but after 4 rounds of testing, that's 20 people, 20 different people. If you want to reuse participants, then you'll also need to run each test with a much larger participant sample. So my view is, don't reuse participants. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments.